Thank you for your welcome, and I'm glad to be here talking about hemp, which is a crop I don't often get an opportunity to talk about, but was a crop which I loved growing and loved doing research on. And just to go back over the history of hemp research in Teagasc, and I suppose there's been a fairly rich history of Teagasc. Teagasc was preceded by an organisation called On Forest Tuluntas, which was formed in the late 50s. And very early on in the history of An Forest Tuluntas, people were interested in the potential of hemp. So AFT was formed in the late 1950s. From 1960s onwards, people were interested in the potential of hemp. And there have been three separate research programs on hemp over the history of AFT and Teagasc. The first was conducted by a researcher called Michael Neenan in the 60s, and Michael was interested in using hemp as a source of fibre for both paper and textile production. Further research was done in the late 1990s by a researcher called Jim Crowley, who was mainly interested in using hemp as a feedstock for medium density fibreboard production. And more recently, I was involved in research on the potential of hemp as an energy crop. Now, all this research was essentially geared at looking at the agronomy of hemp, of how to grow it, although there were different uses for hemp in mind. So this is a picture of Michael Neenan outside Oak Park House beside big stooks of hemp, which were how stalks were dried at the time after they were retted in a retting pond. And as I said, most of Michael's work was done on agronomy, but he went a little bit further than that because he was interested in the use of hemp for paper production and fibre production. He went on after harvest to look at the suitability of hemp grown in Ireland for both paper manufacturing and textile production as well. And what Michael found is that for paper making, for which hemp stalks, unretted hemp stalks were cut and then pulped, that the paper quality of hemp produced in Ireland was comparable to that of wood. And for fibre production equally, he found that the quality of fibre produced from hemp grown in Ireland was quite suitable for textile production. After that, in the 1990s, a researcher called Jim Crowley was interested in the cultivation of hemp as a feedstock for medium density fibreboard production. And again, as with all our research, Jim was primarily interested in agronomy. From the time in the interval between Michael Neenan's research and Jim's research, there had been breeding of hemp and varieties had moved on. And Jim was, first of all, interested in the potential of the varieties which were available at the time. And most of these varieties are still available. And so Jim did quite a bit of work on the potential of different varieties, and in particular on the yield potential of them, and found that, for example, that the highest yields could be got from late maturing varieties, and that's simply a function of the length of their growing season. The earlier crops produce a flower, the earlier they stop growing, and the less radiation they've intercepted in that time between sowing and flowering. As a result, their yield is lower. So the production of fibre hemp, as far as stem yields is concerned, late maturing varieties were best. Jim was also interested in seed rates, and as far as the production of biomass is concerned and fibre, found that you couldn't really push the yields of the crop by pushing up seed rates, and that's true for some crops, but not for hemp. And that the optimum seed rate was around 30 kilograms per hectare of seed, and that's a reasonable result from an economic point of view, because a seed is one of the more major inputs for hemp production as far as cost is concerned. For certain types of fibre quality, it is of course necessary to use higher seed rates, but if you're just producing biomass, a seed rate of 30 kilograms a hectare is perfectly adequate. And Jim was also interested in the effect of sowing date on yields, and he sowed crops at different sowing dates, and you can see from early April until mid-May that there's a gradual reduction in yield, and the reason for that is that crops flower at the same time because of their response to photoperiod, and that the later they're sown, the less radiation they absorb and the less yield that they produce. We have sown hemp as early as March, but it's not something that we recommend because hemp does have frost sensitivity. It's not that it's very sensitive to frost, it's about similar frost sensitivity to sugar beet, and sugar beet sowing guidelines are a good indication of when hemp can be sown around the country. But generally speaking, our approach has been to be ready to go from the 1st of April onwards, and so when we get good conditions. Because it's not a great crop to be mucked in either, so we always wait for good conditions. That brings us up to about 2008 when we became interested in hemp again. And in 2008 there was quite a bit of interest in the cultivation of hemp as an energy crop. There was a lot of enthusiasm for the production of biomass for energy around that time, and most of that enthusiasm, I suppose, was for the production of perennial energy crops like willow and muscanthus, but people were also interested in the production of an annual energy crop, and this seemed to be a very, very good idea because, you know, the cultivation of a perennial crop doesn't suit every farmer, and it seemed to be a good idea, particularly for tillage farmers, of having the choice of an annual energy crop so people could dip in and out of the energy market, and as they could include a crop like hemp in their rotation. So in 2008 about 150 hectares of hemp was grown for energy by different people, different groups who had an interest in both hemp and in energy production. But at the same time, we had lost the sugar beet industry in 2006, and we were particularly interested in replacement break crops. And hence we had an added interest in hemp because hemp is an excellent break crop. It grows very, very tall and suppresses the weeds, so there's less weed pressure in the succeeding crop. It drops its leaves onto the soil, so there's a very efficient return of nutrients to the soil. But in addition to that, hemp grows by a nice thick rhizome, which grows quite deep, and there's an even deeper rooting structure, and that means that the growth of the rhizome breaks up the soil nicely, reduces any compaction effects, and overall improves the structure of the soil. So we were interested in hemp both as an energy crop but also as a break crop. And just to mention, you know, energy crops are crops which produce high yields of biomass for low inputs. And in any of the research which I've described, either Michael Nealon's research or Jim Crowley's research or more recent research, all the hemp crops which were grown at Oak Park were grown successfully without the use of any pesticides, either herbicides, fungicides or insecticides. Broadleaf weed control can be a problem. But what we found is that once we established the crop in good conditions and it got to this stage, it effectively smothered any weeds, even quite challenging weeds like volunteer potatoes. The crop is actually very, very good at suppressing weeds, and of course this contributes to its value as a break crop. Most years we didn't see any diseases in the crop. In one particularly wet year we did see some botrytis and sclerotinia in a particularly wet year, but in a site where there was a history of oilseed rape production, so the incidence of these diseases was as much related to the cropping history of that site as to the very, very wet year, and we didn't encounter any insect problems. And I'll come back to talking about weeds, pests, diseases and the advantage of hemp in being grown without any input of pesticides a little bit later on. But from the point of view of an energy crop, these are all benefits because we don't need to spend money on these inputs. There's no guarantee that that's going to last if the crop was widely cultivated, but it's a good point to be starting from. So, in addition to the presence or absence of pesticides, we were also interested in what sort of nutrients were needed for the crop. So one of the first nutrients we were interested in was potassium. Crops that grow very, very tall often have a high requirement for potassium, and we found that, sure enough, that the hemp crops will take up a lot of potassium if they're given it. But as far as the response of hemp to potassium fertilization, these are three different varieties of hemp grown on a potassium index 1 site, so the lowest index of potassium, which we usually try to get people to avoid, so that they built up potassium levels in their soil. But you do find potassium index 1 soils in the country, and we found that even though we applied quite a lot of potassium to these crops, there wasn't a response to yield, which meant that the crop could do quite well without this particular fertilizer, even if grown in quite exhausted soils. We were also interested in the response to nitrogen. Of course, for an energy crop, nitrogen is a very, very expensive element, both in terms of economics, but also in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. And when we did soils on Index 1 sites, so these are essentially tillage sites, we found that really the optimum, the economic optimum for growing hemp was somewhere around here 100 to 120 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare, and of course that reduces as it reduces with the availability of nitrogen in the soil, which of course is a function of cropping history. And we were also interested to see if we could stimulate the production of the crop by the way that we split nitrogen. So we split nitrogen in different ways. We either applied it at sowing, 2 weeks after sowing, a sort of a month after sowing, or we split it between these 3 dates. But we found that the crop's response to nitrogen didn't really depend on the time of fertilization. As long as it had nitrogen by the time it was about a foot or foot and a half tall, it seemed to be quite happy with that. And these, the results of these fertilizer trials have been incorporated in nutrient guidelines for fibre hemp, which are available in the Teagasc Green Book, which is available on our website. But in addition to this basic agronomy research, we were interested in, well, how does hemp as an energy crop compare to the types of perennial energy crops which we were doing work on at the time, like willow and miscanthus, and how does it compare to other energy crops that people were cultivating and have been cultivating, crops like oilseed rape and sugar beet around Europe as first generation biofuel crops. So we were interested in doing a comparison of how hemp stood up in comparison to these other crops, and actually what we found is that hemp stood up quite well. Even compared to perennial energy crops like miscanthus and hemp, miscanthus and willow, beg your pardon, the net greenhouse gas mitigation of hemp was slightly lower in these when grown on arable soils, but mainly that was due to the fact that an annual crop doesn't sequester an awful lot of carbon compared to a perennial crop, so that was the reason it didn't quite make the net greenhouse gas abatement that crops like willow and miscanthus were showing. But it compared really, really favourably to annual energy crops like oilseed rape and sugar beet. And when you look at grassland, the cultivation of miscanthus and willow on grassland, where often there's very, very little carbon sequestration, actually hemp was even a little bit better than perennial energy crops like miscanthus and willow. Just to mention that as a part of this research, it wasn't the primary focus of this research, but we were also interested in the cultivation of hemp for seed production. So we did work with crops like finola and Uso 31, where we grew them and did nitrogen fertilization experiments and did a certain amount of harvesting research on these crops, seed crops essentially. But a lot of our work was associated with, I suppose, the techniques of harvesting hemp, because hemp, not necessarily a difficult crop to harvest, but it can be a very, very difficult crop to harvest if you choose the wrong machinery. So we were interested both in how hemp dries, how fibre hemp dries after it's cut, but in addition to that, what machinery could be, which was available, could be used to harvest it. So this was the results of several years of experiments on how hemp dried after cutting. So the blue line here is the amount of rainfall which fell in September after a crop had been cut, and the red dots are the moisture content of hemp. So you can see that here initially, after a week after cutting, even though there had been a certain amount of rain, that the hemp stalks had dried from moisture content of 65% down to a moisture content 35%. So an awful lot of drying occurred, even though the weather was quite wet. In this one particular year, there was a very, very rainy day shortly after that, and the stalks picked up a little bit of moisture again. But after 3 or 4 weeks, they had effectively dried down to a moisture content of 18%. And I'm just showing that slide to illustrate that even under very, very wet conditions, that good drying can be expected from hemp. In addition to the drying, a lot of our harvesting work just looked at the difficulties or benefits of using different agricultural machinery that was around. As I said, not necessarily a difficult crop to harvest, but sort of some types of machinery which have rotating elements can render harvesting very, very difficult. So we looked at a wide range of agricultural machinery just to see what was possible and what was not a runner at all. So one of the first things we looked at is mowing, and we quickly found out that mowers with conditioners were a non-runner. Similarly, drum mowers, not particularly good. It often depends on the distance between the drums, but often what happens when you cut hemp with drum mowers is that the hemp stalks wrap around the drums. Doesn't work at all with a small 5-foot drum mower. This is with a 7-foot drum mower, which was a little bit better, worked for a while before it stopped. Some people have used drum mowers with wider spaces between the drums quite successfully, but it's not an ideal piece of of machinery, and again it's because anything that rotates like a conditioner or a drum, in the case of a rotary mower, hemp is going to wrap around it. Disc mowers without conditioners like this work quite well. After a while, pieces of stem sort of worked into the discs, but generally speaking, that wasn't a huge problem. Finger bar mowers work quite well. Problem with finger bar mowers is that they're quite slow. Every now and again, when pieces of hemp stalk get stuck between the fingers and the knife, the clutch can kick out, but generally speaking, finger bar mowers work quite well. But really what we found worked best was when hemp stalks were cut into a number of different pieces, and this aided drying and also aided baling at the end of the day. And machinery like these have started to be developed over the last 10 years in the UK and on the continent, and essentially they're tiered reciprocating mowers, either driven mechanically by PTO or pneumatically. And these work quite well, both in terms of cutting the crop and in subsequent baling of the crop. For raking, we found that hay rakes with a cam type action, which essentially did that, worked quite well and formed nice swarts ready for baling. Balers really depended on how the crop was cut in the beginning. There weren't many problems with balers if the crop was cut into a number of different sections when it was cut. But if it wasn't, it was all cut down as one length of stalk. Sometimes it worked quite well in the case of this Lely baler, but in other cases, this was how we spent an afternoon after using a chrome baler, which we had at the time, just pulling hemp out of the baler. But in fairness, these problems are really eliminated if the crop is cut into a number of pieces. Just to sum up, our own experience of hemp, and I mentioned previously that the organisation and its predecessor have been interested in hemp for a long time. We found it to be a crop that grows quite well in Irish conditions and produces high yields of stem. We found from our own trials that it's very modest fertiliser requirements, particularly compared to other crops. This, I think, is quite an important advantage, that we were able to grow hemp without any pesticides. Now, there's no reason to believe that widespread cultivation of hemp would lead to no problems with pests or diseases, and often crops which are introduced and eventually become susceptible to some pests and diseases. But in the current environment, where there's reducing basket of chemistry for combating pests and diseases, and in addition to that, there's also increasing resistance to the use of pesticides in agriculture. I think this is an important starting point, the fact that so far we've been able to grow hemp with no or modest agrochemical inputs. In addition to that, it's a crop that, because it grows by this nice thick rhizomes, improves soil structure and reduces weed pressure as well. So there's quite a number of reasons to I suppose, support our interest and our enthusiasm of hemp, and to understand that, if markets were to develop, and they are developing, but if markets were to develop further, I think this could be quite an important crop in Irish agriculture. No, thank you.